Hey, welcome to our podcast. I'm Caroline.
And I'm Camille.
And we're your hosts.
In history class, we've been learning about the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War was fought in the Vietnamese jungles, which was new for American troops because of the inconsistent weather in the jungle, which is something they had not experienced before. The air was thick and hot and had mosquitoes flying around them, buzzing in their ears, which made it more difficult for them to fight.
Wow, I couldn't imagine. It was especially hard for them because they were not used to this hot weather, which affected their fighting, and the U.S. had been going through the Cold War and was not really interested in getting physically involved in another country.
The Vietnam War was very controversial and led to lots of debate and disagreement in the U.S. between people for and opposed to the war.
Yes, everyone has a different opinion on this war. Caroline, do you think that the U.S. should have fought in the war?
I think that the U.S. had good reason to get involved in the war, but I don't think that they should have participated to the extent which they did, because while attempting to stop the spread of communism, the United States lost many American soldiers, resources, and money. The war also had extreme psychological and physical effects on the soldiers.
I agree. Go more into the effects it had on the troops.
Many soldiers came home with PTSD and trauma from all that they had seen in Vietnam. While fighting in Vietnam, many of them developed drug and alcohol problems because they used it to cope with what they were going through.
The psychological toll of the soldiers during this war, according to Vietnam CWA4, it showed that 382 people died from self-inflicted death, which means a lot of their mental well-being suffered for a war that in the end didn't win. So they decided to end it all. The Vietnam War was also televised, and that divided the country onto sides. The Hawks was the name given to Americans who were pro the war, and the Dubs were those against the Vietnam War. Before Vietnam, only soldiers knew what war was really like. At first, the reports were super positive about the war, but as time went on, the reports became more negative.
How do you know?
According to PBS NewsHour Classroom, much of the reporting of the Vietnam War was positive until the mid-1960s because many Americans thought the soldiers were defending Vietnam from communist aggression, also known as containment. But by the late 1960s, when the reports showed that the U.S. was making no progress, it made people rethink the war and why the U.S. were even fighting in it, making people's views on the war more negative.
Yes, I agree. By the end of the war, the U.S. troops had assumed almost all of the fighting for the South Vietnamese troops. The United States soldiers found it difficult to fight in a foreign place against people who were fighting for their own land. This led to really low morale for the soldiers and contributed to many of the addictions and mental health issues they faced after the war.
Vietnam was the first war that was ever really televised. In the first war, where journalists could really gain access to the soldiers in the battlefield. And according to PBS NewsHour Classroom, Vietnam's history, its culture, and its politics made this war different from any other that America have fought for.
Yeah, and all that led to psychological effects on regular citizens and people being biased about the war, causing protests to start all over the country, leaving the United States vulnerable.
At the end of the war, over 1 million North Vietnamese died and around 58,000 U.S. soldiers died. But at the end of the war, when Nixon ended it, why did all those people die for a war that was unachievable?
After Nixon pulled the U.S. troops out of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong took over almost immediately. This was very discouraging for Americans because for years they had been fighting in a war that they didn't fully understand, and now it seemed as though it was all for nothing. Again, while the U.S. government was hoping to stop the expansion of communism, I think that it came at too great of a price.
One of the biggest reasons we should have gotten involved in the war is how it affected the soldiers. Caroline, didn't you read a story about how a soldier that fought in the Vietnam War?
Yes, a Vietnam veteran named James Alderman did an interview, and he talked about how the war affected him. For over 50 years, he tried to deal with the trauma by himself before seeking professional help. After he arrived in Vietnam, he discovered one of his friends who had killed himself, and he had to clean it up. He explained much of what they saw in Vietnam was pure, unadulterated gut terror, and the visions and smells still haunt him. He said, "We saw things that would give you nightmares for the rest of your lives, but we carry it in our hearts so everybody else can sleep."
Wow, I can't imagine what that must have been like and how he has to carry that with him from now on. Suicide was a big issue for the veterans. 1 in 3 Vietnam veterans suffer from PTSD and 382 killed themselves.
Also, over 300,000 were wounded and 75,000 left severely disabled after the war.
Well, that is a lot of people that lost their lives.
To summarize, I think that the U.S. shouldn't have fought in the war because of all that it cost Americans and the divide that it came with in our country. It was also just unnecessary that we stayed involved as long as we did, and to the extent which we did.
I agree. Also, because the communists immediately took over after we left, which shows how difficult it was to fight against people in their native country. The mental wounds that the soldiers endured also proves that we should not have been involved.
We would like to thank the veterans for their service and all that they did in Vietnam.
When the soldiers came back from Vietnam, they were often shamed for their service in Vietnam, when they had no choice but to fight. The soldiers did not get any recognition for their hard work until the soldiers came back from Iraq years later. The people threw a parade, and during the parade, they also recognized the soldiers from Vietnam because they were never thanked for their service.
Thank you all for listening.